Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 10 of Via Satellite's Future Space Economy webcast series. My name is Jeffrey Hill. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Today's episode is titled How Startups Are Shaping the Future Space Economy Narrative, and we have three guest speakers joining us today to discuss what they feel are the greatest opportunities for startups to succeed in an expanding space ecosystem. We'll also talk about how private investors are balancing between long-term promises and short-term needs for ROI, and how startups and investors play a role in shaping new space policy. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank our Future Space Economy Season 1 sponsors, Kepler Communications, delivering affordable network connectivity across the globe via a growing network of small satellites, Sidus Space, a vertically integrated space and defense as a service company providing low-cost, rapidly scalable, customized solutions and services, and also Spider Oak, a leading satellite cybersecurity company with a mission to protect your most important civil, military, and commercial space operations. Please take a moment to visit our website at onorbitspace.com to learn about our sponsor companies and how they've engaged with us to create this educational series. So thank you once again to Kepler, Sidus Space, and Spider Oak for making this happen. I have three special guests with me today, but before we get started, I want to remind everybody watching that we'd like you to become a part of this discussion, and you can do that by submitting questions to us through the Q&A portal. It is on the right-hand side of your interface. You click on Q&A, and you can send us a question. I don't wait until the very end to ask audience questions. If it's relevant to what we're talking about, I'll weave that into our discussion. I also keep everybody anonymous, so I won't say your name or your company. You can ask the questions you need to ask, and I will facilitate those questions for you. So that said, let's get started. Over the course of this debut season of Future Space Economy, we've learned how dependent both the public and private sector space investors are on startups and bringing new ideas and technologies to life. Today's startups are pitching their products as the glue that will hold this future space economy together. And I'd like to start by introducing two leaders from two very successful space startups who have joined us today, starting with Dr. Luisa Buinhas. She is the co-founder and chief project officer of the German space company Vioma Space, which is developing technology to reduce space debris and provide safety for today's space infrastructure. This past summer, Vioma teamed up with Endurosat to work on what is being billed as Europe's first commercial mission for in-situ space situational awareness. Luisa also is the grand prize winner of our 2022 Startup Space Competition at Satellite. So Luisa, it's great to see you again. Welcome. Can you start off by just telling us a little bit more about the operating system that Vioma is developing and how it works to reduce space debris?
Right. So thanks a lot for the kind introduction, Jeffrey. It's a pleasure to be here today. Actually, so at Vioma, we work on two fronts to address space situational awareness and space sustainability. So the first one is information. So we collect information about space objects, either it being satellites, other satellites, or debris. At the moment, we use telescopes on the ground to make observations and gather information about these objects. However, given the limitation of ground-based sensors, actually, what we're trying to do is something complementary in the future. So at the end of 2024, we will launch the first two pilot telescopes into a low Earth orbit to make observations of other objects. And of course, the advantages of being spaceborne is that we are not affected by atmosphere. We observe 24/7 and can make very accurate trajectory estimates of space objects. And then just maybe to finalize this short introduction on Vioma, on the second front, what we do to address space situational awareness is developing algorithms to automate satellite operations using the data that we commercialize. So for example, for detecting threatening behaviors or simply predicting collisions with space debris, we can leverage this space intelligence and then provide satellite operation services such as behavioral threat warnings, or collision avoidance maneuvers. So that's it. That's Vioma in a nutshell.
Thank you so much, Louisa. It's good to have you with us. Next, we have Tim Kienberger. He's the CEO of LeoStella, a satellite and space infrastructure manufacturer that is also leveraging state-of-the-art intelligence design tools and controls to speed up the production of complex systems like constellations. Their newest satellite bus, the LS300, can accommodate heavier and larger payloads up to 250 kilograms. And prior to joining LeoStella, Tim built executive level programs at manufacturers like L3Harris and Boeing. So Tim, thank you so much for joining us today. It's good to have you here. Being that you have this background working with the largest legacy space companies, can you start us off by telling us what's different and unique about LeoStella's approach to manufacturing?
Yeah, thanks, Jeffrey. Appreciate the opportunity to discuss this with you. So I think what's unique about LeoStella, what it brings to the marketplace that the companies I had in the past didn't have, is this ability to rethink the way you build satellites so that we can build them faster and think less about the shiny object that we're building and more about the service we're trying to provide to the customers, the end users. So we've recrafted this effectively a greenfield in the last 5 years. It didn't exist before, into an ability to build multiple satellites in a very small footprint. Demonstrated 19 operational satellites on orbit, great track record, a lot of experience growing within this team pretty rapidly. Where I said in the past, the more traditional companies, you might work your entire career to get even close to this type of expertise. So that's kind of what LeoStella kind of brings to the table, is the ability to help our customers get their assets into space that help feed that data model, right? We're all about trying to make sure we're giving them the data that they need.
Thank you so much, Tim. So we have a infrastructure provider, builder, and also infrastructure protector, and building this giant operating system in space. We also have with us somebody who's going to provide the unique investor and government perspective. We have Maher Ezzedine. He is the Chief Executive Director of IdeanCo, an idea innovator company with offices in New York, Calgary, Dubai, Beirut, and London, and representative offices in over 40 cities. He's also chairman of the Harvard Aerospace and Defense Alumni Organization at Harvard University. Maher was one of the first supporters of our startup space competition and is now in its 8th year. He's also an advisor on this webcast. I know he's very excited about this topic. Maher, it's good to see you again. Great to have you here. IdeanCo is a unique firm in the entrepreneurial space. So could you tell us a little bit about what your company does?
Right. First of all, Jeffrey, thank you for having me. Appreciate it. So us as a company, we started back in 1999. We're an idea innovator company. We focus on providing strategy consultancy for customers in the verticals of aerospace, climate change, and other, of course, verticals out there. What makes us so unique? We are one of the pioneers of creating the crowdsourcing business model out there. We started with this business model in 1999. It's been with us ever since, and we couldn't be more proud to be part of the gig economy today. We have 3 core services within our company. We've got the advisory arm, the challenge-based learning academy, and the innovation lab, out of which this topic is more relevant to both the innovation lab and the advisory arm. Our strategy consultancy, we've been engaged with anything above the stratosphere, which is space exploration, towards GEO, LEO, MEO, and nano satellites. And below the stratosphere, aviation, whether it's commercial or on the defense side, and a little bit of cybersecurity. So in a nutshell, this is who we are. Yes. And as for Harvard, I lead the effort on translational research translation in the field of aerospace and defense. And it covers all Harvard alum and friends of Harvard. And the idea here is to attract new talent to Harvard, but also at the same time to produce products and services that are so original and innovative to create the jobs of the future and future jobs in this unique industry.
Thank you so much, Maher. I'm glad that you described the future space economy as a gig economy, because if I remember correctly, you were one of the first people that I spoke with who predicted the growth of this economy as a gig economy, which is a interesting evolution that's happened over the last few years. Maher, I know you only have time to be with us for the first half of today's webcast, so I'm going to start things off with you. Just get our conversation kicked off here. As I mentioned, over the past few episodes here of Future Space Economy, we've always identified startups as expected to provide those new solutions or unthought of solutions to existing problems or challenges that are preventing us from developing the in-space infrastructure. From your perspective, like, what are some of the most important problems or challenges that the industry needs to solve in order to build a thriving space economy? And where do you see startups, which of those issues and problems do you see startups taking advantage of building solutions to those problems?
Jeffrey, before I dive into the actual question itself, I just want to mention that us as human beings, we require uncertainties in our life. We have to have it. But of course, we shouldn't exceed a certain threshold on that uncertainties, because if we do, then it causes a certain level of stagnation and we can't operate. But uncertainties is so critical for us because this is where creativity comes into play, and it comes into resolving critical issues, challenges, and providing solutions, hopefully with a global impact. So to dive into the question, we need to take a step back to recognize a major paradigm shift where recent technological advancement, I believe it dramatically reduced costs and barrier to space explorations, out of which it encouraged the private sector, the likes of SpaceX and Blue Origin and many others, and we have some of them here on the webinar today, to participate in space activities traditionally reserved for the government. So if you go back in time, this particular sphere was for the government. Now it's becoming more of a private sector. And now that we have the private sector taking a leading role in this space, its involvement has fostered competition, leading towards innovative business model, which is great. And of course, we have original products and services. Maybe I shouldn't say original, I should say amended products and services, much more optimized, much more efficient, and reliable, lower launch costs, and a flood of funding coming from VCs, whether coming from private equity firms or seed angel capital or high net worth individuals, all of which are currently contributing to a flourishing space economy as we know it today. So startups in any industry, not just in the aerospace industry, are always looking for unique uncertainties or challenges, and they work really hard to provide a solution for such uncertainties. In the aerospace and defense sphere, we need to take into consideration the platforms as to where the challenges and the opportunities exist. So we have, as we already know, we have 4 unique platforms, but to answer, I'm going to add a 5th one to it. So we've got land, air, sea, space, and funny enough, we add regulators into the ecosystem, because regulators, as much as they want to draft policies to help the ecosystem, at one point, or I wouldn't say most of the time, but sometimes they draft policies that may cause hurdle in the system. So therefore, that's a unique challenge that needs to be resolved on its own. Again, land, air, space, and regulators. We also need to take into consideration the buyers' focus countries, or the consumers or the businesses, their intent, their habits of utilizing such new technologies. So the uncertainties are critical for startups, and uncertainties are the buyer's future challenge. So therefore, the way we see it at Idea&Co, and the way I see it myself, responding to the present while preparing for the future is critical, and this is how we can identify and tackle challenges. Again, responding to the present while preparing for the future. And I'm going to be brief here. I know that we're limited on time. In the last few days and earlier today, I attended virtually a summit in Saudi Arabia in Riyadh, and this is the Future Initiative. It's called the Future Investment Initiative Summit, FII. And funny enough, today's theme was based on AI and aerospace. So the buyer's strategic challenge in the kingdom is to create a collaborative industry, which is a joint industry, meaning joint ventures, to attract FDI, to create state-of-the-art R&D, and above all, it's the influx of knowledge transfer that they're hungry for. And all four key components are keys to create more jobs within the kingdom. So now we have 4 key challenges, and the kingdom, they see those as challenges, but also they see them as pillars of change, pillars of opportunities, pillars of innovation, which is kind of unique. So to go back to your question, we see cost, for us, and when we advise our customers, whether they are existing clients, corporates or startups, cost plays a key role. Decreasing launch cost and providing affordable satellite manufacturing. This is so critical. It's a competitive advantage. It's very important. Why? Because eventually it reflects positively on the end user, meaning the end user can afford such technology on planet Earth. From a sustainability perspective, we see a lot of challenges in the ecosystem. All of us today on planet Earth, we know that climate change is taking a major role in everything that we do. So from a sustainability perspective, I know that Dr. Louisa mentioned something about space debris. So space debris in space is something that we need to take into consideration, and it's so crucial for maintaining sustainable space environment. We have decarbonization in space. In the past we used to call it air pollution. Now it's becoming a trendy topic, decarbonization, and it's in space. It's also a critical issue across all industries. And in the space sector, we have, for example, the rocket launches, which generates significant amount of carbon emission. And this is a key challenge. And it's also an opportunity here to develop, for instance, something related to green propulsion technologies, such as electric or hybrid propulsion, which can really significantly reduce emissions. And then we've got, which reminds me, by the way, NASA, I know that NASA is working on nuclear fuel cells the size of poppy seeds, which could power NASA's next venture. And this is the lunar base once it begins operation in 2030. You've got manufacturing. I know that Tim, he mentioned something about manufacturing just right now. And on-orbit assembly, this is the newest trend, and it's so sexy, but at the same time, it's very expensive today's date. But I know this is going to take form and shape in the near future. So utilizing space resources and on-orbit assembly to reduce materials and energy required for launches from Earth. Again, I go back to NASA. They have the on-site resource utilization. So they're using Hawaii as a test bed to create from 3D printers certain elements from the soil, and so they can build either shelters or colonies. And this can be utilitarian eventually on the lunar surface or the red planets. Robotics plays a key role in this particular sphere, which brings me to my last point, the return on investment. In everything we do in space, people always ask me, what's this got to do with us on Earth? I mean, come on, we're spending billions of dollars in space. My advice to startups, when they are looking for challenges to resolve, they need to also take into consideration the commercial model behind this particular challenge. If it doesn't make sense today, it may make sense tomorrow, meaning put it on hold. So you need to be able to identify certain challenges in the future that can be resolved today, but it needs to bring a sense of good return on investment to that particular business model. So I'll stop right here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maher. Tim, I'll go to you next. I mean, Maher listed, he outlined the entire list of challenges ranging from costs, environmental costs, from investors' perspectives, but also from the entire economy's perspective. From a startup's perspective, like when you see those list of challenges, what do you feel are the most important to solve now, immediately, and which ones are do we address as we go into the future?
Yeah, I think to start a little bit backwards, what Maher said, return on investment is ultimately important for all the startups that are out there, that especially when we're building infrastructure for them. And we're seeing a lot of, they want to try the market first. So those factors are really critical to make their business model close. Launch has been a big factor in that, the reduction in launch costs for sure. The other big factor there has been the small satellite evolution of increasing capability and our ability to manufacture these faster. One of the areas that I think is still a bit of a struggle for the new space markets is this first mover technology concept, right? So a lot of investment goes into generating advanced technology. I'm on the manufacturing side. I want to build a lot of that technology. So productizing that, making that affordable so I can sell the customer an affordable product, that becomes an area of focus for us. So how do we move that state-of-the-art technology into something that's more affordable so we can produce more better revenue satellites for our customers, right? So that's a key focus in an area that's difficult to deal with. Regulatory for sure is very important. It certainly has an impact on everything that we do, from operations through building of the satellites. But to get to one of the other points that Maher brought up, I agree with him. On-orbit assembly is a huge opportunity for the growth area, I would say, for a new satellite market. It kind of spans in between regulatory a bit, because now we're talking about standards. How would I, say, launch a satellite in different components, and then on space I could pick one payload for this mission, and then the same bus can pick a different payload for another mission and assemble itself on orbit. So certainly robotics, but also standards. How do we make that play across multiple companies and multiple divisions? So that's an area that's, I think, new space is more open to than traditional space markets, where we would talk about standards but never really wanted to play together in those standard space, right? Here in the new space market, it's more about how fast I can deliver that capability to my customer, rather than how do I keep my shiny object to myself, if I can say that again. So hopefully that gives a little perspective from my side there.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. Luis, I'll go to you next. I mean, your business is based on solving a problem that many see becoming more serious over time. I mean, do you want to add to anything that Maher and Tim have said in terms of from a startup's perspective, the role you play in solving those problems and kind of bringing new ideas to the larger space industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I will first maybe start the answer by picking up on some of the points that Maher and Tim mentioned about in-orbit manufacturing and in-orbit assembly. I think us witnessing these sort of new services from orbit is really a paradigm shift of companies realizing that we're not building, space assets to serve people here on Earth, but we're actually building space assets to serve other satellites, right? And this is the point of in-orbit repair, in-orbit refueling, manufacturing, assembly. Also, these new concepts of constellations that serve communications, that serve as basically relays for other satellites, that serve as computing centers in space for other satellites. So there's this whole new this whole new space economy that is being built around space assets, rather than, for directly for us humans on the ground. And I think this paradigm shift is very important. And I think this will be a stepping stone for us, probably to start populating areas not only around Earth, but beyond. So I think this collaborative paradigm shift is very important. But I also want to mention that us witnessing this new space race, because of cheaper access to space, because of launches, because of lower manufacturing costs, this obviously also creates a congestion problem in space, right? And it's almost as if space is a victim of its own success. That we're seeing so much traffic now and an accumulation of material in orbit. So I think that in order to have this healthy growth of the space economy, we need really to look into the future and stop the problems before they become too big, and take some of the lessons learned that we learned from Earth in terms of sustainability and prevent bigger issues. And I think debris mitigation is really one of these key aspects. So trying to perform a very accurate map of the space environment, for example. So we see value in this. I also want to mention that also in terms of solving problems, I think we're in this new era where you have trillions of terabytes of data that are being created nowadays, right? But you also need to have the mechanisms and the ability to process all of this data. So I think all of the technologies that go in the direction of processing data, and especially processing it in an efficient way, perhaps even from orbit, are probably going to be change makers in the space domain. So I think also cybersecurity is a very big topic, but I think in order to move on with the topics, I think I'll keep my answer brief for now.
No, thank you so much, Louisa. Maher, I'm going to jump back over to you. I'm going to refer to some things that both you and Tim and Louisa said. You talked about building this space economy. It was a job that used to fall largely on government shoulders. Because the government can afford to invest in solving long-term problems, right? And you didn't necessarily need an ROI. Now with startups, if they're getting private investment, you're going to not only have to solve a solution to a problem, but if that problem is something that might happen in the long term, or if you're trying to create the solution to something that will happen, in 10 years, you also have to pitch the viability of your business model, right? How patient are private investors, especially compared to the government? How do you create value? How do startups create value for investors along the way as they're working toward a long-term vision?
Right. So Jeffrey, just to let you know that investors. Normally, the investors that we work with, which is they are irrelevant to the space industry, they're so impatient and they want to get their money today. But in the sphere of space industry and space exploration and satellites, the investors that we approach, they're not really the typical day-to-day investor. They have to be extremely patient and they have to believe in the long run. Besides that, there's short term to be achieved. The long term is so critical. It's a critical component. And before I came back to the company that I started, IDENCO, I used to work for a satellite operator for many years. I outsourced my capabilities to be part of this satellite operator, in which we launched at that time 2 satellites into orbit. And the investors, they are a government entity. But they put a lot of pressure on the business development team to sell the capacity in space. And that capacity was Ka-band, it was military Ka-band capacity, and it was commercial Ku-band, C-band. And also there was another satellite that has an L-band. So we're talking fixed satellites and mobile satellites. The thing is, at one point, if there's some sort of disconnection between leadership, middle management, and investors. So the investors, they need a return on their investment today. And at the same time, the management, they put pressure on their team to get that investment today. This can create a major hurdle in this ecosystem. On the other hand, if the investors, they understand that this is a long-term strategy and we're going to get our return on investment in the long run, I guarantee you, this is a successful business model. So to answer your question, the investors, whether they are VC fund or private equity, or at one point you may get high net worth individuals, which is the case in today's ecosystem, there's a long-term strategy that they need to take into consideration. Patience plays a key role here. And the return on investment, you get it in 10 years, 15 years down the road. This is the time, if you have a geosatellite, this is the time when you're going to go ahead and replace that particular geosatellite with another satellite, because the life cycle almost ended there. So to go back to your question, patience plays a key role with the investors.
Thank you so much, Maher. We're at 1:30. I don't know if is this when you have to jump off? Do you have a couple of? I think you're on mute.
I can take another question. It's fine.
Oh, okay. I wanted to ask you, the one question before you jump off here. And this one we had worked on together. The rise of generative AI has sparked a new debate over ethics and technology. And in the space industry, there's a healthy debate over sustainability, environmental issues, as we mentioned before, related to the commercialization of space. How does the space industry, commercial space industry, as well as startups, how do they navigate through these concerns? And how do we, in essence, how do we achieve our goals in space without messing things up here on Earth, like you mentioned with some of the environmental factors?
Jeffrey, something that we're, all of us as human beings right now on planet Earth, we're really concerned about AI. So now AI is at the generative stage. Just imagine how concerned we will be when it becomes intuitive. We're not there yet. Just imagine. So I have to admit, it's not easy to navigate, let's call it a spaceship, through such a space concerns to achieve your goals on planet Earth. With the generative AI, it certainly ignited debates and discussions regarding ethics and technology. And this is across various sectors, various verticals, not just the space industry. And today's day, generative AI is capable of creating new content from existing data. Again, I always say, just imagine when it becomes intuitive. Oh my God. So you have to be well prepared. And the era of generative AI that we're going through right now, this is wonderful for us. We should take it from a positive perspective, because this is the only time for us to regulate, to bring certain policies into play that can protect us. So generative AI has a huge positive potential in accelerating the future of our space industry. And the rise of AI models can enable, at one point, you have to take that into consideration, that it can enable adversaries to enhance their capabilities in a very, very, very short period of time. And this may pose challenges to existing power or existing established ecosystems. And this may cause security breach. Therefore, cybersecurity plays a key role in this particular sphere. And major investment should go into cybersecurity. To achieve our goals on Earth, I know this question has it's a multi-layer question. To achieve our goals on Earth with the presence of generative AI, we need to highlight and pick and choose our battles in terms of challenges. Which is something that we have to really find a remedy for them. The application, for instance, the application of AI in space technologies, it presents a range of legal and ethical challenges. This is something that we should take into consideration. I wish I have an answer for you. This is a fairly new field. We are still tackling such challenges as we speak today. The arrival of AI in space activities is seen as of a new industrial and military revolution. And I know that the U.S. Department of Defense and other military entities in the West, they're taking advantage of this AI, but again, for a good reason. The regulation and the use of the development of AI within the space sector. So regulatory arm plays a key role. Going back to the second part of the question, which is related to sustainability and the environment, as we all know, and ethical issues. The ethical debate surrounding AI is misinformation, distribution of harmful content, which is really a major concern to us within our company, to me personally. Especially, I have two girls, so I'm very much concerned with what's happening out there. Disruption to society also. So it requires a multidisciplinary approach involving legal, ethical, technological, and sector-specific expertise, whether it's in space or any other verticals out there, to ensure that we have the full deployment of generative AI and other advanced technologies in space is done responsibly, ethically, and sustainably before it becomes intuitive. It's so critical. I always say that, and I stress on that, because if we don't do this today and it goes into intuitive, it's very difficult to stop it. Which brings me to my last point, and this is related to the military interest. As we all know, military, they've been interested in space for many, many years. Historically, countries have used space for military purposes, such as communication. Then you have the GPS, which is navigation. And then, of course, you have intelligence gathering and many other tools that they've used in space. And by the way, for the audience, they may want to explore treaties such as the Outer Space Treaty. In Vienna, the Outer Space Treaty is something that was designed by UNOSA, which is United Nations Office for, I forgot the name, for outer space affairs. They're based in Vienna. I've been to their offices a couple of times. They've designed this treaty. But now with AI being in place, this treaty means nothing. So it needs to be amended so it can reflect peacefully on the outer space. It needs to be amended with the generative AI and the upcoming intuitive AI. And to go back to your question, something related to the military, there's, of course, as you already know, during former President Trump, he kickstarted the Space Force in the US. Well, I completely agree with the Space Force. I'm with it 110%. The reason behind it, because as space economy grows, some major power, like the US, has no other choice but to pursue a strategy in space to protect assets in space. But this will also create a race in space and the emergence of new actors into space. So that's something that we have to take into consideration. Therefore, navigating the complex ethical, environmental, and the militarization concerns in the growing space economy requires a holistic, multi-stakeholder approach, that's for sure.
Well, thank you so much, Maher. I know you tried to provide as much information as you could with the limited time you have. So thank you. I appreciate you being here with us. If you have to jump off now, we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you for having me.
Tim, I'm gonna move over to you. Maher gave us a very wide angle lens answer here to a lot of different concerns brought up in the question here, but I'm going to simplify it, kind of narrow it a little bit for you. I mean, this is the classic could we versus should we debate. Let's take something like you mentioned, like on orbit manufacturing. Like how does that address like some sustainability issues and how do we make space more environmentally sustainable or friendly for these future commercial applications?
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion, I would say, that's going on in that field, Jeffrey. It's really about coming up with new technologies. Let's take an example, propulsion. And I think Maher probably brought up also not only propulsion, but also new battery technologies that are being developed. It's important to advance those technologies to a product level so we can start deploying those out. Electric propulsion is an example of moving from very corrosive combustible fuels to something that's a little bit more benign. Still a little bit aggressive with the xenon there, but still, it's quite a bit different than using a biprop system and some very corrosive chemicals, right? So, same with battery technologies, nuclear propulsion ideas that are coming and evolving. All these technologies are great and they're popping out. I think the challenge at the manufacturing level is how do we turn those into affordable manufacturing? and insert them into our satellites. And I think we're better positioned in the commercial marketplace than, say, the government funded programs are, because they're driven still largely by, they have a set of requirements that they're trying to build to, whereas when we look at, a customer comes to us and says, hey, I need to accomplish a data source in space, can you help me? We look at it more as we're providing a mission capability. What kind of mission capability versus 100 spec compliance do we need to provide to them? And that also gets back into this whole concept of generative AI and machine learning of satellites. I mean, at its simplest form, we want the satellites to start running their own state of health, running the ability to fly the satellites themselves, take over a lot of the operations that we're doing from the ground today. But then more complex, we start adding edge computing, and how can we provide a faster data stream of that data that the satellite's collecting down to the ground. And for sure, there's going to be a series of challenges on the cyber level, right? How do I make sure that that data is not getting inadvertently exploited? How do I make sure someone doesn't actually take over my satellite? It wasn't my intent ever for that to happen. So those are a number of things that we need to consider and make sure that we have right checks and balances on as we roll out new technologies. How does that impact both the manufacturing side as well as what happens in orbit over lifetime, right? I'm not going to bring a nuclear battery back to Earth if I can't reliably make sure that comes back safely. So all those technologies are great. I'm fully endorse, and we need to move forward to productize those. But I think the debate's healthy to have about how do we handle these technologies. And I don't think that this should really be relied upon the government to solve, in my opinion. This is the industry can have these conversations, and we can drive that forward, I think, faster than the government can. The government brings the regulatory authority that comes with it, and that's where we'd like to see the government engage, is understand what we're trying to accomplish and then help us just to make sure that we're, in general, as a group, moving in the right direction, I would say. So I think that's kind of the focus area.
No, that's a good bridge into same question to you, Louisa. How does Vyoma navigate through these issues on a subject like space sustainability that has very little guidance on a global or even national level in terms of regulatory policy?
Yeah, I think it's true that there's very little regulation that exists in place right now to tackle the issue of space sustainability. So there is somewhat of a vacuum that over the last decades, allowed for the problem of space congestion to actually materialize. Now, I think the mindsets are shifting a little bit. So, if you saw something like 3 weeks ago that there was the first fine for a company that was issued because the company failed to dispose of the satellite at the end of the mission. So I think slowly, things are changing from a policy point of view. And I think, of course, we need to take a moment to recognize that there is a huge disconnect between, regulation, policymaking, and, technical evolution. And as always, the laws fall a little bit behind technology. But I think as these problems become more prevalent, so is the awareness. And if you put things into perspective, at any single day of our lives, right now, we have 8 billion people on the planet that depend on space-based services, whether they realize it or not, right? And we're talking about GPS, communications, navigation, weather forecast, all of these things that we take for granted, they rely on space-based services. So I think trying to avoid a catastrophe down the line is a big trigger for policymakers to start, doing the work in the background, laying the groundwork to prevent the issues of tomorrow. With respect, also with the issue of sustainability, I think there are a lot of things on the commercial front that can be done to address this problem. So I think you mentioned, of course, in orbit, assembly, in-orbit manufacturing, in-orbit repairs. But the taking a step back for these, for these services, for this to be in place, spacecraft need to be built with modularity in mind, right? In order to allow to have satellites to have parts that need to be swapped in orbit, repaired in orbit, because otherwise there is a disconnect between the satellite that is being worked on and the manufacturer or the replacer, etc. So standards are something that need to come first to be as a catapult for these new services, I would say. And then I think also from a mitigation point of view is I think we need to start introducing or replacing existing materials with new materials that are a bit more resistant, that are radiation hardened, that delay the degradation of structures in space. But we also need to think a little bit how we design missions, right? So it's important to design a mission with the disposal phase in place at the end of the lifetime of a satellite, either by lowering the satellites back down to the atmosphere, or with propulsion, or through drag maneuvers, or bringing them up to graveyard, higher orbits, heliocentric orbits, because right now there's really no mechanism that obliges mission operators to clean up after themselves. And maybe I want to mention a couple of other final points here. So I think the pooling of resources is probably something that we will have to have in place. So I don't necessarily think that we need hundreds of thousands of satellites providing broadcast communications, right? But if instead of so many cheap satellites, we could have a little bit of an aggregation of these services, the pooling of resources really, which are more resilient from a construction point of view, I think this would already go a long way to alleviate congestion issues in the future. I think the issue of regulation in terms of allowing satellites to be launched into space, I think legislation needs to be stricter, especially for spacecraft that do not meet minimum reliability levels. And I think we all know that CubeSat technologies are not extremely reliable. They have high failure rates. So trying to balance accessibility and affordable access to space to, congestion that we can manage, I think, doing this balancing work is something that we need to establish. Because, it cannot be that democratization of space puts at risk the safety of their orbits. And maybe I will mention one last point, which is probably usually the elephant in the room in all of this, traffic coordination discussions, which is the sharing of information. Right now, there's very little communication between space stakeholders. And if this is an issue now, when we have 15,000 active satellites in orbit, imagine at the end of the decade, when we have 100,000 satellites, right? And if people do not start talking to each other, especially when you try to coordinate the avoidance of close approaches, I think this is going to be problematic. So I think the industry as a whole needs to agree on a minimum amount or a minimum set of data that could be shared in order for operators to know exactly when to maneuver, where it's safe to maneuver now, in 2 hours, in 2 days, in 2 weeks, etc. Because for us to support a healthy growth of the space economy, I think collaboration, data sharing will become very, very relevant.
Okay, and that leads perfectly into our first audience question I want to bring up. So and this actually goes back to something that Tim said, that one of the interesting aspects of being a space startup is you are free to communicate with other people and form different types of relationships along the supply chain. The question from the audience here is, how do new space companies envision collaborating on future space economy projects like the ones we've been discussing? And what strategies are they implementing to foster collaboration within the industry? Tim, I'll start with you on that.
Yeah, sure. So to tie this question back to some of the comments from Ioma, we would hope that, the artificial intelligence that the satellites are going to tie together are going to lead to the ability of satellites to some extent to actually fly themselves. And if you can think of the analogy of cars driving down the freeway where they're communicating to each other, how close they are, I'm going to turn right, I'm going to move into your lane. We'd like to see that same technology evolve into the spacecraft too. So speed up the communication between the satellites by letting them talk to each other at some minimum data set, just like Ioma was talking about. Sorry, Luisa. Apologize for that. But where I see collaboration on the future space economy is it's that type of infrastructure, right? Largely, we need to be able to figure out how do we get our satellites to communicate to each other? How do we advance that ability to provide on-ship situation awareness? And how can we respond faster? I'd rather see that done in space than on the ground, because now you've inserted a time delay that we really want to accelerate faster. We want to deploy that into space. And that's where artificial intelligence has a key role, where it can actually advance that and make that speed go a lot faster. Some of the other areas where I think collaboration will occur in the future is again, my traditional model is we would rarely try to go have someone else build satellites for us. We would always try to do it ourselves. And that's something that new space companies, we're trying to break that barrier a little bit, just like LeoStella did with Hera Systems. We said, hey, these are two new space companies competing together. We're actually going to cooperate and provide each other some production assistance. That's a little unheard of in traditional space markets, but that's sort of the collaboration where you say, okay, I'm going to figure out how do we advance spacecraft, how do we build them faster, how do we deploy them, and how can we share fundamental technologies that further the overall space economy? So I think those are a couple of areas where I think there's some real opportunities to advance and help that future space market grow.
Excellent. Luisa, when I introduced you, I mentioned a collaboration you had with Endurosat that you just recently mentioned. What would you like to add to that answer to this question? Also, maybe like referring to maybe what was the strategy behind that partnership with Endurosat? Yeah, I think before maybe answering your question, just to build up on something that the team on the answer of team is also thinking about, for example, co-sales approaches, right? So partnering up with someone who is either targeting the same customers with a complementary service or product to yours, and then trying to address the same market together through mutual sales. So I think this is also a good approach to foster collaboration between new space companies. Now, this leads me to my second part of the question, and this is exactly what Jeffrey just mentioned. So I think I can only speak for ourselves by giving real examples of how we nurture the new space collaboration. So I think, as I mentioned, so we are in the business of space situational awareness, and we have an upcoming mission next year with 2 pilot satellites carrying telescopes to observe, the space environment, space objects. Now, we are simply, the mission managers of this vision, right? The architects of this vision. We ourselves are not building the spacecraft. We are not building the telescope. We provide only the specifications. We are also not the ones providing the communication services, etc. And whenever, but we cannot launch a satellite without having all of these things in place, right? And so our way to actually
fill these gaps is actually by working with other new space companies. Not because we wanted initially or because we had it in our minds that we would, but actually new space companies, they bring something which is quite appealing to the market, and they are agile, they are fast, they are flexible, and it makes it so much more efficient to work with new space companies, being a new space company ourselves. So it just turned out that it is more effective to work companies that can address our needs faster than traditional companies. And I can give you one very good example. So for example, when we were talking about developing certain features for ground operations of the satellites, whenever we would go to traditional companies, they would give us a very comprehensive package that contains 1 million features that we have no use for, but there's no modularity in their proposition, right? They send you a package, and it's either that costs an arm and a leg. And as a new space company, especially at the time when we initiated this talks, for us it wasn't really interesting. So by actually going to smaller players who could have this flexibility to create a product that was tailored to our size, this was ideal. And I think small companies working with other small companies, this makes us collectively stronger than us working in silos individually. So I think for us, we're extremely proud of all the partnerships that we have had in place so far, because they are mostly new space companies, and we are quite satisfied with the quality of the work and services that they provide, while completely addressing our needs at price points that we're interested, with subscription models and pricing models that are tailored to other new space companies. And also whenever there's feedback that needs to be taken in, they close the loop much faster than traditional players. So I think for us, it just evolved organically that we worked with other new space companies.
Totally agree. Thank you so much, Louisa. We have just a few minutes left, and I want to build on that discussion just a little bit here at the end. And just when you're talking about collaborating with other companies, how startups and established companies are collaborating, like what are some channels or avenues that they can use, or resources that companies can use to share ideas? And I mean, I'd like to shamelessly throw out there that like conferences and industry shows are a way for people to network. But outside of that, like when you're working on solving a problem and you think maybe this other startup or somebody might have an answer, like what are the channels that you use to communicate? Tim, I'll start with you on that. How do you interact with some of your peers at other startups?
Yeah, I would say certainly conferences are a great way to make those connections. Really, it's just direct-to-direct communication, I will say. Kind of cold calls, if you will, a little bit, to just reach out and understand what capabilities exist. And even if you think it's not really an exact fit, it turns out that conversation leads in a direction that turns out to be beneficial. And we've had that happen in a number of opportunities where customers have come to us and asked, can you do this business model? And in some cases, we can say yes. In other cases, we can say, well, no, not exactly. But if you want to change that business model a little bit, here's how we can help you deliver on that. So I think unfortunately, conferences is really still the focus of how you make those connections for a large part. But I think these type of media, where you're able to do sort of online presentations and kind of increase the exposure, online chat groups for sure, and different social media platforms, they all help kind of establish that connection. Ultimately, it leads to kind of one-on-one interaction where you drive out real other opportunities there and solutions that we can bring forward.
Louisa, what resource do you use, especially on like the more technical challenges? Maybe I wonder if do universities play a role in it? Are there like connective events that are strictly about, the engineering side, or when, I'm just curious as to what resources you have available to you when you need to go outside of your own supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, I think conferences, for sure. We try to have we try to invest some of our of course funding and revenues into R&D, and of course this means that we are in regular contact also with universities, and we know fresh minds in academia that always give us another pair of eyes to look at what we're developing, and for sure that's helpful, and also through projects, sometimes collaborations for bidding for certain tenders. This fosters already some connections. But I will say sometimes, because in the new space economy, let's say, there's more this sense of community. It happens often that you get personal introductions from someone, or you get introduced personally to someone who is of your interest. I think there's this less stigma associated with asking for introduction to someone that you want to talk to. I think people are in general very approachable in the new space industry. I think in the space industry as a whole, right? Because even with traditional companies, I think space is still a family, I would say. But in the new space segment, I would say there's still this community feeling where it's easy to reach out to people. And I will mention one last thing, which is, I don't know about the US, but at least in Germany, there's they have an initiative for new space companies, which hosts sometimes kind of discussion groups and events where actually new space companies can come together and discuss aspects related to policy, how to position ourselves in the face of this or that event, in the face of this and that new law that is about to be launched, or the new budget of the German government, etc. So there are these think groups that are organized at national level in Germany, and I find this a very good fora for discussion, and also for getting in touch with other new space companies that are not necessarily in your radar. So I think these events are quite valuable. It's all about people at the end of the day, right? We're still people at the end of the day, and I think anything that fosters a connection, especially an in-person connection, I think it's quite important.
Absolutely, and you're absolutely correct that the space industry, I think, is a bit more friendly about sharing ideas than other industries, which is why I enjoy my job so much. I could not work in a industry where people just don't talk to each other, and there are industries out there where they don't. But we're just about out of time. Louisa, Tim, thank you so much for being with us today. Also, thank you to Maher Ezzedine for joining us, as well as our sponsors, Kepler, Sidus Space, and Spider Oak, for making this possible. Our next episode, focused on sustainability in the future space economy, will be on the week of November 13th. We're working on a specific date that works for the speakers we have, so we'll get that registration link up shortly. Once again, my name is Jeffrey Hill. You've been watching Via Satellite's Future Space Economy webcast. Visit our website onorbitspace.com to watch this or our other 9 episodes on demand. Thank you for being with us, and we hope to see you for the next one in November. Thank you, everybody.